Margaret had never imagined that silence could be so heavy. It pressed down on her shoulders like wet wool, settling into the corners of her modest living room, where dust motes danced in the afternoon light. She sat in her armchair by the window, watching the maple tree in the yard lose its leaves, one by one, as October painted the world in shades of rust and gold. The phone on the side table hadn't rung in 3 weeks, not once, and Margaret knew, with the kind of certainty that comes from a mother's broken heart, that her son Richard wasn't going to call. Not today, not tomorrow, perhaps not ever again. It had been exactly 1 year since she'd signed the papers, 1 year since she'd sat in that lawyer's office with Richard standing behind her, his hand on her shoulder, a gesture she'd mistaken for love, but now understood was something else entirely. Control, perhaps, or impatience. She'd transferred the deed to the house, the one she and Harold had built 43 years ago with their own hands and dreams. She'd signed over the savings account, the small rental property downtown, the shares Harold had carefully accumulated during his 30 years at the plant. Richard had smiled at her then, that same smile she remembered from his childhood when he'd gotten exactly what he wanted. But this time, that smile had made her blood run cold. Margaret pressed her fingers against the window glass, feeling the chill of autumn seeping through. She thought about Harold, gone now for 5 years, and wondered what he would say if he could see what had become of their family. Would he be disappointed in Richard? Or would he be disappointed in her for being so blind, so trusting, so desperate to believe that family meant what she'd always thought it meant? The story really began 2 years earlier, though Margaret hadn't recognized it at the time. She'd been 68 then, still strong, still sharp, still believing that the life she'd built was solid and permanent. Richard had started visiting more frequently, he and his wife Jennifer coming by for Sunday dinners, bringing expensive wine and talk of investments. Margaret had been so pleased. After years of feeling like Richard was too busy for his old mother, suddenly he was attentive, interested in her life, asking questions about Harold's affairs, about the properties, about her plans for the future. Jennifer had been particularly sweet. She'd sit next to Margaret on the porch, holding her hand, talking about how important family was, how they needed to take care of each other. She'd brought photo albums and helped Margaret organize them, listening to stories about Richard's childhood, about the early years of Margaret and Harold's marriage, about the struggles and triumphs that had shaped their lives. Margaret had felt grateful for the attention. She'd felt seen, valued, loved. What a fool she'd been. The signs had been there, of course. Looking back, Margaret could see them clearly now, like reading a map after you've already gotten lost. The way Richard had started talking about her age, about her memory, about how confusing finances could be for someone at her stage of life. The way Jennifer had begun mentioning retirement communities, places where Margaret could just relax and not worry about maintaining a house or managing properties. The way they'd both started telling stories at family gatherings about Margaret forgetting things, small things, normal things, the kind of things everyone forgets, but telling them with an edge of concern that made others worry. Margaret remembered the Thanksgiving dinner where it had all started to crystallize. Richard's younger sister, Claire, had been there with her family. Claire, who lived 3 states away and called every Sunday without fail. Claire, who'd always been the gentle one, the peacemaker, the daughter who remembered birthdays and sent flowers just because. Richard had stood up during dessert and announced that he and Jennifer were concerned about Margaret living alone. He'd painted a picture of a woman declining, struggling, at risk. Margaret had sat there, fork frozen halfway to her mouth, as her son described someone she didn't recognize, someone confused, forgetful, unable to manage basic tasks. Claire had defended her. "Mom's fine, Richard. She's sharp as ever. What are you talking about?" But Richard had been prepared. He'd pulled out a list, times Margaret had supposedly forgotten appointments, bills that hadn't been paid, phone calls she hadn't returned. Most of it was exaggerated or outright false, but it was presented so confidently, with such apparent concern, that even Claire had started to look uncertain. Jennifer had added her own observations, little anecdotes that sounded caring, but painted Margaret as increasingly incompetent. Margaret had been so shocked she hadn't defended herself properly. She'd mumbled something about being fine, about not needing help, but the damage was done. The seed was planted, and Richard had watered it carefully over the following months. The lawyer's office had come 6 months after that Thanksgiving. Richard had told her it was just getting affairs in order, making sure everything was properly organized, so that when the time came, and he'd smiled when he said this, that tender, patient smile, there wouldn't be any confusion or legal complications. Margaret had trusted him. He was her son, her firstborn, the baby she'd nursed through colic and walked through nightmares and cheered through little league games. How could she not trust him? She'd signed everything, every single paper he'd put in front of her, while the lawyer, Richard's lawyer, she realized now, had watched with professional neutrality. She'd transferred the house into Richard's name, added him to all her accounts, signed a power of attorney that gave him control over her financial decisions. He'd told her it was just a safety measure. He'd told her nothing would change. He'd told her she could stay in the house as long as she wanted, that it was still her home, that he just wanted to make sure everything was protected. 3 weeks later, Jennifer had called with the news. They'd decided to sell the house. The market was strong, and they needed the money for Richard's business expansion. Margaret would need to move out within 90 days. There was a lovely assisted living facility they'd found for her, nothing fancy, but clean and safe, with activities, and meal service. Richard had already paid the deposit with money from the account that was no longer Margaret's. Margaret had felt the world tilt. She'd called Richard, her voice shaking, asking him to explain, asking him how this could be happening. He'd been cold on the phone, distant. He'd told her this was what was best, that she wasn't getting any younger, that he and Jennifer had their own lives to think about, their own future to secure. When Margaret had started to cry, when she'd begged him to reconsider, he'd told her she was being emotional and dramatic. Then he'd hung up. Claire had driven for 8 hours when Margaret had finally worked up the courage to call her. She'd arrived with fury in her eyes and a lawyer's card in her hand. But by then, it was too late. The papers were legal. The transfer was complete. Richard had been careful, thorough. There was nothing to be done. Margaret owned nothing. Not the house, not the savings, not the rental property that had been generating her modest income. She was, at 69 years old, essentially penniless and homeless. Claire had wanted to fight anyway. She'd wanted to sue, to challenge the power of attorney, to prove undue influence. But Margaret had stopped her. The thought of dragging her son through court, of airing their family's destruction in public, of spending what little money she might recover on legal fees, it had been too much. She'd felt tired in a way she'd never felt before, tired in her bones, in her soul. She'd told Claire to let it go. The assisted living facility had been worse than Margaret could have imagined. Not because it was dirty or dangerous. It was actually quite clean and well-staffed. But it wasn't home. Her room was a 12 by 12 box with a bathroom and a small kitchenette. She'd been allowed to bring some furniture, but most of her belongings, a lifetime of accumulated memories, had been sold or given away. Richard had hired an estate sale company to clear out the house before putting it on the market. Margaret hadn't been allowed to attend. Jennifer had told her it would be too emotional, and that they'd save anything important for her. They hadn't saved much. A few photo albums, her wedding china, boxed and stored in Claire's garage, Harold's purple heart from Korea, the quilt Margaret's mother had made, which now lay across the narrow bed in her assisted living room. Everything else, the furniture Harold had refinished, the paintings they'd collected over decades of travel, the kitchen table where they'd shared thousands of meals and conversations, all of it sold to strangers for pennies on the dollar. Margaret had spent the first month in that facility in a fog. She'd gone to the group activities because the staff encouraged it, but she'd sat in the corner, silent, watching other residents play bingo and make crafts and chat about their grandchildren. She'd felt hollow, erased, like Richard hadn't just taken her possessions, but her identity, her purpose, her very self. Claire had called every day. She'd offered to let Margaret move in with her, but Margaret had refused. Claire had 3 teenagers and a demanding job. She didn't need the burden of a broken old woman Margaret had tried to sound positive on those calls, tried to tell Claire she was adjusting, that the facility was fine, that she was making friends. But Claire knew her mother too well to be fooled. It was during the 3rd month that Margaret had met Walter. He lived down the hall, a tall man with white hair and kind eyes, who always smiled when they passed in the corridor. One afternoon, he'd stopped at her door and asked if she played chess. Margaret hadn't played in years, not since Harold had died, but something about Walter's gentle manner had made her say yes. They'd played chess 3 times a week after that, usually in the common room where afternoon light slanted through the windows. Walter didn't pry, didn't ask probing questions, didn't seem to need Margaret to explain herself. They played and talked about simple things, the weather, books they'd read, memories from their youth. It was comfortable, easy. For those hours with Walter, Margaret had felt almost like herself again. Walter had his own story, of course. His wife had died 7 years earlier, and his daughter lived overseas. He'd chosen the facility himself, sold his house voluntarily, arranged everything on his own terms. He'd told Margaret this matter-of-factly, not with pride, but with a quiet satisfaction that came from maintaining agency over his own life. Margaret had envied that. She'd envied the dignity of his choice. 6 months after moving into the facility, Margaret had received a letter from Richard. Not a call, a letter, formal and cold. He and Jennifer were expecting their first child. They'd bought a new house, larger and more suitable for a growing family. They wouldn't be able to visit as much going forward, but they hoped Margaret understood. The letter hadn't mentioned the house Richard had sold, the one that had been Margaret's home. It hadn't mentioned the money. It hadn't included an apology or an acknowledgement of pain caused. It was simply a notification, the kind you might send to a distant acquaintance. Margaret had held that letter for a long time, sitting in her small room, feeling emotions war inside her chest. Rage, grief, a terrible, aching love that hadn't died despite everything. He was going to be a father, her son, and she was going to be a grandmother. But instead of joy, all she felt was a crushing sadness. What kind of father would Richard be? Would he teach his child to value family? Or would he teach the same cold calculus that had allowed him to discard his own mother? Would Jennifer, sweet Jennifer with her careful poison, raise a child to see people as resources to be managed and eventually discarded? Margaret hadn't responded to the letter. What could she say? Congratulations on your baby, and thank you for destroying my life. I hope your child brings you joy and never learns what you did to me. There were no words that felt right, so she'd chosen silence. Claire had been livid when she'd found out. She'd called Richard herself, had screamed at him for 20 minutes about honor and family and basic human decency. Richard had listened in silence and then hung up on her too. After that, Claire had stopped mentioning him. She'd focused all her energy on making sure Margaret was okay, on calling and visiting, on trying to fill the void that Richard's betrayal had created. But Claire couldn't fix it. No one could. The seasons had changed outside Margaret's window. Summer came, hot and humid, turning the facility's carefully maintained gardens into a riot of color. Margaret had started walking outside in the early mornings, before the heat became oppressive. She'd found herself thinking about Harold during those walks, remembering their life together, wondering what message he might have been trying to send her by leaving her in this situation. Because surely there was a lesson here, some wisdom to be gleaned from the pain. Harold had been a simple man in the best sense of the word. He'd worked hard, loved deeply, valued integrity above all else. He'd raised Richard to be honest and kind, or at least he'd tried. Where had it gone wrong? Margaret had replayed Richard's childhood in her mind 1,000 times, searching for the moment when her bright, affectionate boy had turned into the cold man who could look his mother in the eye and take everything she had. She'd never found that moment. Perhaps it hadn't been a single instant, but a gradual erosion, invisible until it was complete. Walter had noticed her sadness deepening. One afternoon during their chess game, he'd looked up from the board and asked directly, but gently, what had brought her to this place. And Margaret, surprised by her own need to speak, had told him everything. The whole story had spilled out: the manipulation, the betrayal, the loss, the silence that had followed. Walter had listened without interrupting, his expression growing more troubled as the story unfolded. When she'd finished, Walter had been quiet for a long moment. Then he'd told her something that would change everything. He had a friend, a lawyer named Thomas Brennan, who specialized in elder law. Thomas had built his practice on helping seniors who'd been financially exploited by family members. Walter said that what Richard had done, regardless of the paperwork, sounded like undue influence, possibly even fraud. He said Margaret deserved at least a consultation, a second opinion, a chance to understand whether she really had no recourse. Margaret had resisted at first. She'd already been through this with Claire, already accepted that the legal battle was lost before it could begin. But Walter had been persistent in his gentle way. He'd made the call himself, set up the appointment, offered to come with her for moral support. And Margaret, surprised to find she still had fight left in her after all, had agreed. Thomas Brennan's office had been nothing like Richard's lawyer's sleek downtown suite. It was a modest space above a bookstore, filled with case files and law books and photographs of Thomas with elderly clients, their faces beaming with victory or relief or simple gratitude. Thomas himself was younger than Margaret had expected, maybe 50, with wire-rimmed glasses and a manner that was both professional and genuinely warm. He'd reviewed Margaret's documents for over an hour, asking questions, making notes, occasionally shaking his head or muttering under his breath. Finally, He'd looked up at Margaret and delivered his assessment. Yes, the papers were legal. Yes, the transfers had been properly executed. But the circumstances surrounding those transfers, the systematic undermining of Margaret's competence, the isolation from other family members, the speed with which Richard had acted after gaining control, all of it suggested a pattern of undue influence that might be challenged in court. More importantly, Thomas had explained something Margaret hadn't known. In her state, adult children who exercised power of attorney had a fiduciary duty to act in their parents' best interest, not their own. Richard's immediate sale of Margaret's home, the liquidation of her assets, the placement in a facility without her genuine consent, all of it potentially violated that duty. There might be a case, not a guaranteed win, but a real chance at justice. Margaret had felt something stir in her chest that she barely recognized anymore. Hope, fragile and frightening. Thomas had outlined the process. They'd file a petition alleging financial exploitation and undue influence. They'd request an accounting of how Richard had used Margaret's assets. They'd seek to void the power of attorney and potentially restore Margaret's property rights. It would be difficult, Thomas had warned. It would be expensive, though he'd work on contingency if necessary. It would be emotionally devastating to air all of this publicly, and it would permanently destroy whatever remained of her relationship with Richard. Is there anything left to destroy? Margaret had asked, and Thomas had nodded slowly, understanding. Claire had cried when Margaret had told her about the meeting with Thomas. They'd been tears of relief and vindication and fierce pride. She'd flown out immediately to help prepare the case, gathering evidence, documenting every conversation and letter, building a timeline of Richard's manipulation. The sisters who'd helped after Harold's death reappeared, offering testimony about Richard's behavior at the funeral, his immediate interest in the estate, his dismissive treatment of Margaret's grief. The petition had been filed on a Tuesday morning in September. Richard had been served with papers at his office. Margaret had imagined that moment many times, his shock, his anger, his realization that his mother wasn't the helpless old woman he'd believed her to be. She'd wondered if Jennifer had been there, if they'd panicked together, if they'd felt even a moment of guilt or fear. Richard's response had been swift and vicious. He'd hired an expensive litigation firm that immediately went on the offensive. They'd filed motions challenging the petition, questioning Margaret's mental competence, arguing that she was being manipulated by Claire and opportunistic lawyers who smelled money. They'd subpoenaed Margaret's medical records, hoping to find evidence of cognitive decline. They'd demanded depositions from everyone involved, trying to intimidate or exhaust the opposition. But Thomas Brennan had seen it all before. He'd countered every motion, protected Margaret from the most aggressive tactics, and steadily built their case. He'd arranged for Margaret to undergo a thorough neuropsychological evaluation, which had confirmed what everyone who actually knew her understood. She was cognitively intact, capable of making her own decisions, and had been so throughout the entire period in question. The process had been grueling. Margaret had been deposed for 6 hours, forced to relive every moment of the betrayal, while Richard's lawyers tried to trip her up, to make her seem confused or vindictive or manipulated by others. She'd held firm, though it had cost her dearly. Some nights, she'd lain in her narrow bed at the facility, staring at the ceiling, wondering if fighting back was worth the emotional toll. Walter had been her anchor during those months. He'd reminded her that dignity didn't come from avoiding conflict, but from standing up for what was right, even when it was hard. He'd shared stories from his own life, times when he'd had to fight for principle over comfort. He'd played chess with her and let her cry, and never once suggested she should give up. The trial had been set for March, 18 months after Richard had forced Margaret from her home. As the date approached, Margaret had felt her resolve strengthen. She'd moved through the facility differently, her spine straighter, her voice firmer. Other residents had noticed. They'd started coming to her with their own stories, their own experiences with family members who'd taken advantage, who'd stolen, who'd abandoned. Margaret had listened to each one, feeling the weight of collective grief and anger and determination. 2 weeks before the trial, Richard had requested a meeting. Through the lawyers, carefully structured and official, he wanted to settle. Margaret's first instinct had been to refuse. She wanted her day in court, wanted Richard to face public accountability for what he'd done. But Thomas had counseled caution. Trials were unpredictable. Judges could be influenced by a son's apparent remorse or concern, and if they lost, Margaret would have nothing. The settlement negotiation had taken place in a conference room at Thomas's office. Richard had sat across from Margaret, Jennifer beside him, both of them dressed conservatively and wearing expressions of practiced concern. Their lawyer had started by offering to return 20% of the liquidated assets, calling it a generous gesture meant to help Margaret while acknowledging Richard's right to the property under the legal transfers. Margaret had laughed, actually laughed, a harsh sound that surprised even her. Then she'd leaned forward and looked her son in the eye for the first time in over a year. She'd told him exactly what she wanted: the full value of the house and properties, with interest, the return of Harold's remaining personal effects, a written apology acknowledging the manipulation and harm caused. And this had been her own addition, made in the moment. Richard was to donate $50,000 to a nonprofit that helped seniors who'd been financially exploited by family members. In Harold's name, Richard had gone pale. His lawyer had sputtered about unreasonable demands. Jennifer had started to speak, but Margaret had cut her off with a look that could have frozen fire. She told them they had 24 hours to accept the terms, or she'd see them in court, where she'd request the judge order a full forensic accounting of every penny Richard had taken. She'd stood up and walked out, leaving them sitting in shocked silence. They'd accepted the terms with an hour to spare. The settlement had been finalized quickly after that. Large checks had been transferred, property titles restored where possible, the apology drafted and signed. Margaret had read that apology a dozen times, studying Richard's signature, trying to find some hint of genuine remorse in the carefully worded legal language. She hadn't found any. With the settlement money, Margaret had done something no one expected. She'd bought a small house, not large or fancy, but hers, with a garden and a front porch, and room for the furniture that had been in Claire's storage. She'd created a space that felt like home again, slowly and carefully, choosing each piece with intention. Walter had helped her plant roses along the fence, his presence steady and comfortable as they worked together in the spring sunshine. Claire had visited often, bringing her teenagers who'd never really known their grandmother before this. Margaret had watched them explore the house, asking questions about the photographs on the walls, the history contained in each object. She'd felt time shifting, realizing that what she built now would be their inheritance, not just material things, but the story of resilience, of standing up for oneself, of the possibility of new beginnings, even late in life. She hadn't heard from Richard since the settlement. Sometimes she wondered about the baby, her grandchild, now almost a year old, a person she'd never met and might never know. That grief was different from the other losses, more abstract, but somehow deeper. She thought about the stories that child would hear about her, the way Richard and Jennifer would shape that narrative. Would they tell the truth, or would they paint Margaret as difficult, vindictive, unfair? Margaret had learned to carry that grief alongside everything else. She'd learned that healing wasn't about forgetting or forgiving before she was ready. It was about building a life that had meaning despite the wounds, about finding purpose in the empty spaces. She'd started volunteering at a legal aid clinic, helping other seniors navigate the complexities of elder law. Thomas had been pleased to have her expertise, not legal expertise, but the understanding that came from lived experience. One evening in late summer, almost 2 years after Richard had first betrayed her, Margaret had been sitting on her front porch when a car pulled up. She tensed, recognizing it immediately. Richard had gotten out slowly, alone, and stood on the sidewalk looking at the house. He'd seemed older somehow, worn down by something Margaret couldn't name. They'd stared at each other for a long moment. Then Richard had walked up the path and stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. He'd opened his mouth several times, searching for words, finally managing a simple, "Hi, Mom." Margaret had felt 1,000 responses rise in her throat: anger, questions, accusations, the urge to send him away, to protect herself from more pain. But she'd also felt something else, a weary curiosity about what had brought him here, what had finally broken through whatever wall he'd built between them. "You can sit," she'd said, gesturing to the chair beside hers. "But I won't pretend the past didn't happen." Richard had climbed the steps and sat down, keeping careful distance between them. For a long time they'd been silent, watching the sun set behind the trees, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. Then, haltingly, Richard had started to talk, not to make excuses or defend himself, though Margaret had braced for that, but to confess. He'd told her about the debt he'd been drowning in, business decisions that had gone wrong, investments that had failed. He'd told her about Jennifer's family's expectations, the pressure to appear successful, the desperate feeling that he was failing at everything. He'd told her how easy it had been to see Margaret's assets as a solution, how he'd convinced himself she didn't really need all that money, all that property, that he was actually helping by taking control. Margaret had listened without interrupting, her face neutral. When Richard finished, she'd let the silence stretch, making him wait. Then she'd asked the only question that mattered. "Do you understand what you did to me? Not just financially, but as a person, as your mother?" Richard had started to cry then. Not dramatic sobs, but quiet tears that ran down his face unchecked. He'd nodded slowly. He'd said yes. He understood. He'd said he'd been seeing a therapist for months, trying to understand how he'd become someone who could hurt his mother so deeply. He'd said he didn't expect forgiveness. He'd said he just wanted her to know that he was sorry, truly sorry, and that he was trying to become someone worthy of being her son again, even if it was too late. Margaret had felt her own eyes sting. Part of her wanted to reach out, to comfort him, to let maternal instinct override everything else. But she'd held back. This moment required truth, not comfort. She'd told Richard that she appreciated him coming, appreciated his honesty. But she'd also told him that rebuilding trust would take years, if it could be rebuilt at all. She'd told him she needed to see sustained change, not just words, but actions. She'd told him she wouldn't let him back into her life until she was certain he wouldn't hurt her again. Richard had nodded, accepting her terms. He'd stood to leave, then paused. He'd asked if he could come back in a month, just to sit like this, to try to show her he was serious about making amends. Margaret had thought about it, then agreed. Small steps, boundaries, no guarantees. After Richard left, Margaret had sat on the porch until full darkness fell. She thought about Harold, about what he would make of all this. She thought about the granddaughter or grandson she'd never met, about whether there would ever be a relationship there. She thought about forgiveness and justice, and whether the two could coexist. Walter had come by later that evening, bringing soup he'd made, and finding Margaret still on the porch, wrapped in a blanket against the cooling air. He'd sat beside her, not asking what was wrong, but just being present. Margaret had told him about Richard's visit, about the confusion of feeling anger and hope and grief, all tangled together. Walter had said something that stayed with her. Healing isn't about going back to who you were before you were hurt. It's about becoming someone who can live with what happened and still find joy. Margaret had let those words sink in, feeling their weight and wisdom. The months that followed had been complicated. Richard had come back, as promised, once a month. Each visit was careful, bounded, focused on small talk and gradual rebuilding. He told her about his daughter named Emily, after Harold's mother, and eventually brought photos. Margaret had looked at her granddaughter's face and felt love and loss in equal measure. She'd asked questions, learning about milestones and personality, letting herself care while protecting her heart. Jennifer had never come with Richard. Margaret suspected the marriage was struggling under the weight of what they'd done. Though Richard never said so explicitly, there was a hollowness in his eyes when he mentioned his wife, a distance that spoke of its own betrayals and reckonings. Claire had been skeptical of Richard's attempts at reconciliation. She'd warned Margaret to be careful, to protect herself, not to let hope override caution. Margaret had appreciated the concern, but reminded Claire that this was her decision to make. She was done with other people determining her life's course. The legal clinic work had expanded. Margaret had become a familiar face there, sitting with frightened seniors who'd just discovered their accounts were empty, who'd been pressured to sign documents they didn't understand, who'd been discarded by children they'd sacrificed everything to raise. She'd held their hands and shared her story and helped them understand they weren't alone, weren't foolish, weren't to blame for trusting family. Thomas had joked that she should go to law school, that she had a natural gift for this work. Margaret had laughed, but felt pride bloom in her chest. She'd found purpose in the wreckage, built meaning from pain. That counted for something. On what would have been her and Harold's 48th wedding anniversary, Margaret had visited his grave. She'd brought flowers, yellow roses, his favorite, and sat on the grass beside his headstone. She'd talked to him the way she always did, telling him about everything that had happened, asking his opinion, feeling his presence in the quiet spaces between her words. She'd told Harold about Richard's visits, about the grandson he'd never met, about her uncertainty about the future. She'd cried a little, missing him, wishing he was there to help navigate these impossible situations. But she'd also felt his pride in her, in how she'd fought back, in the person she'd become through surviving. As Margaret walked back to her car that day, she'd felt lighter somehow. The weight of silence that had pressed down on her 2 years earlier had lifted, replaced by something more complex, but ultimately more bearable. She'd learned that families could break, and sometimes, with enormous effort and grace, begin to mend. She'd learned that dignity came from within, not from what others chose to give or take away. She'd learned that even at 71 years old, she was capable of rebuilding, of starting over, of creating a life that honored both her losses and her resilience. Walter had proposed marriage the following spring. Not a grand romantic gesture, but a practical suggestion offered over chess in Margaret's garden. They were good together, he'd said. They enjoyed each other's company. They could face the remaining years as partners, rather than just friends. Margaret had been surprised by how much she wanted to say yes. They'd married quietly in Claire's backyard, with just family and close friends present. Richard had asked to come, and after much consideration, Margaret had allowed it. He'd stood at the back, watching his mother marry a man he'd never met, looking like someone who understood exactly what he'd lost. Margaret had seen him crying during the ceremony and felt a complicated mix of vindication and sadness. Emily had been there two years old now, running through the grass in a flower girl dress she kept trying to take off. Margaret had held her granddaughter for the first time that day, feeling the solid weight of her, smelling her baby shampoo, seeing Harold's eyes looking back at her from that small face. It had been overwhelming and bittersweet and precious beyond words. The relationship with Richard remained fragile. They saw each other occasionally, always in public places or with others present. The easy intimacy of mother and son was gone, perhaps forever. But there was something else now, a careful honesty, a mutual understanding that trust once broken required constant vigilance to maintain. Richard was trying. Margaret could see it in his choices, in how he spoke to her, in his willingness to accept boundaries without argument. Whether that would be enough remained to be seen. Margaret and Walter had created a life together that felt whole despite its cracks. They traveled modestly, visiting places neither had seen before. They volunteered together at the legal clinic. They hosted Claire's family and Walter's daughter when she visited from abroad. They played chess and gardened and read books aloud to each other in the evenings. It was a good life. Not the life Margaret had imagined back when Harold was alive and Richard was still her beloved son, but good nonetheless. On quiet days, Margaret sometimes thought about the woman she'd been 3 years earlier sitting in that assisted living facility, believing her life was over, seeing herself as a victim of circumstances she couldn't control. She thought about how easy it would have been to stay in that story, to let bitterness consume her remaining years, to die alone and angry and diminished. She'd chosen differently. Not easily, not without cost, but decisively. She'd chosen to fight for herself when no one else would. She'd chosen to rebuild when it seemed impossible. She'd chosen to remain open to love and connection, even after betrayal. Those choices had defined her more than Richard's actions ever could. Margaret had learned that aging wasn't about decline or loss or becoming invisible. It could be about hard-won wisdom, about resilience tested and proven, about the courage to start over when starting over seemed absurd. she'd learned that you could lose almost everything and still find joy. That family could break you or rebuild you, sometimes both. That silence could be heavy, but so could hope. On the morning of her 72nd birthday, Margaret woke in the house she'd chosen, next to the man she'd chosen, in a life she'd built from ruins. The phone rang Claire, calling to wish her happy birthday, to tell her the kids were excited about the party they'd planned. Then Walter appeared with coffee and a small gift, his presence warm and solid and real. Later that morning, an envelope arrived in the mail. No return address, but Margaret recognized Richard's handwriting. Inside was a card, not store-bought, but handmade, with Emily's crayon scribbles decorating the front. Richard's message was simple. I'm trying to be the father and son I should have been. Thank you for letting me try. Happy birthday, Mom. Margaret held that card for a long time, feeling emotions she'd learned to name and hold without being overwhelmed by them. Grief for what was lost, hope for what might slowly be rebuilt, gratitude for the life she'd fought to reclaim. Love, complicated, painful, persistent, for the son who'd hurt her so deeply and was now struggling to find his way back. She placed the card on her mantle, next to the photo of Harold, the picture of Emily from the wedding, the framed thank you note from a senior she'd helped at the legal clinic. All of it together, the beautiful and the broken, the past and the present, the people who'd loved her well, and the ones who'd learned too late what they'd lost. This was her life now. Not perfect, not what she'd planned, but hers, earned through every difficult choice, every moment she'd chosen hope over bitterness, every time she'd opened her heart despite the risk. Margaret looked around her home, felt Walter's presence in the next room, thought about Claire calling again later, about Richard's slow return, about Emily growing up in a world more complicated than Margaret had ever imagined. And in that moment, standing in her kitchen with morning sun streaming through the window, Margaret felt something she'd thought she'd lost forever. Peace, not the absence of pain, but the presence of meaning. Not forgetting, but integrating, not going back, but moving forward with wisdom and grace. The phone rang again. Walter called from TH, other room that it was probably more birthday wishes. Margaret smiled, took a breath, and reached for the phone, ready for whatever came next. Strong enough now to face it, wise enough to know that healing was a choice she could make again and again, every single day. Outside, the maple tree in her yard was beginning to leaf out, green returning after winter's long silence. The seasons turned. Life continued. And Margaret, who'd learned to carry both grief and hope, both loss and possibility, walked forward into whatever time remained, not as a victim, but as someone who'd survived and fought and found her way back home.